The Mystery of the Chained Oak. A reimagining of the legend of the Chained Oak. By Chris Trotter. Charles Talbot, the 15th Earl of Shrewsbury, bustled out of the inn, clad in a heavy jacket and black top hat, and jumped into the waiting carriage. Before getting in, he shouted to the driver, "Get me home as fast as you can, Mayfield. Right you are, my lord." The driver lashed his whip, and the smart carriage pulled away from the inn, heading towards the Earl's palatial home, Alton Towers, an enormous Gothic pile surrounded by private parkland. Talbot sat rigid in the back, the hat still in his head, staring at the red padding across from him. He was in a foul mood. The meeting with the village council had turned sour. More money, they wanted. They were bleeding him dry. This time it was for repairing the road into the village. He had told them they would have to find the money elsewhere this time. Always they came to him, begging for funds. They had once asked him for money to build an almshouse, at which the Earl had scoffed at them, telling them that the poor could starve for all he cared, before going to the local inn and ordering himself a hearty dinner with a carafe of red wine. He often frequented the Old Oak Inn, an old establishment with good food and drink, and a roaring fire in winter. On this rather cold evening he had sat right by the side of it with a glass of claret, while he flexed his fingers continuously, the frustration burning inside him. Charles did not like parting with his money unless it was to satisfy his own wants. And why not? It was his after all, although he had made little of it himself, most of it coming from the family estate. He had used a huge sum of it to build himself a home that was fitting for a man of his title. They were a great family, the Shrewsburys, and Charles came from a long line of earls. His ancestor had been in the court of Queen Elizabeth I, and had been entrusted to guard the Catholic Mary Stuart while she was in England. What would his legacy be, he wondered, as the carriage rushed through the night? Perhaps the house itself, perhaps the lavish parties he so often held there, with their pomp and ceremony, inviting all the noble and wealthy folk he could think of. Yes. They were charging along the forest road now, which passed the enormous old oak tree, after which the village inn had been named. It had stood there for hundreds of years. Often Talbot would walk out to see it. He loved trees, and for him this oak represented strength and endurance, like his own family, he thought. To him it was no coincidence that this tree should be so near the boundary of his estate. It stood watching over and protecting him, ensuring the continuation of his line. Suddenly, as the carriage approached it, a figure ran out from behind the enormous trunk and rooted itself in the middle of the road. The driver yanked the horses to a grinding halt. Talbot was thrown from his seat, his hat knocked off. "What in God's name?" he roared angrily. He jumped from the carriage to see what had halted his journey. It was then that he saw the woman, illuminated in the torchlight on the front of the carriage. "What is this?" he cried. "Who the hell are you?" The old woman, for that was what she was, flung herself on her knees before the Earl. "Oh, sir, my husband is dead. Dead from madness, they say. I have no one to support me, and no money for food. If I go on like this much longer, I will join my husband in eternity. I beg you to give me some money so that I will survive." "How dare you!" shrieked Charles. "Be off with you at once, you foul, haggard old woman." He turned abruptly to remount his carriage. "Charles Talbot." When the Earl turned back, the old woman had risen to her feet and was standing, staring at him with an intense gaze. Her features seemed almost to have changed in that instant. She was no longer the weak lady begging on her knees. Now she was somebody altogether different. "You like the old oak, do you not? If you send me away without a penny, it will no longer be the tree you admire. It will become your doom." Angry as he was, Charles actually laughed at the old woman's words. "Your husband died of madness, did he? You sound like you're going the same way." And opening the carriage door, he climbed in and slammed it shut. As the carriage pulled away, he could hear the old woman shrieking after him. "For every branch on the old oak tree that falls, a member of your family will die." Charles was positively seething now. He hadn't seen her around before, and he hoped he wouldn't again. If she knew what was good for her, she would keep herself to herself from now on. When the Earl arrived home, he strolled into his enormous entrance hall. The head butler was there to greet him. "Good evening, Bring me a nightcap at once," demanded Charles as he walked straight past. He headed upstairs to his bedchamber. The large windows looked out over the lawn. It had begun to rain, the droplets pattering against the glass. Charles sat down in his large four-poster bed and sighed heavily. What an evening, he thought. His nightcap arrived, along with his manservant, who undressed him and prepared him for sleep. When he was gone, Charles sipped on his cognac and tried to let his mind drift. The rain outside eventually turned into a torrential downpour as dark storm clouds rolled in from the east. Charles had fallen asleep long before the thunder growled menacingly overhead, and angry forks of red-hot lightning leapt out of the clouds, reaching for anything they could get at. The old oak tree was there for the taking. A bolt hit one of the branches with tremendous force, sending sparks and splinters of wood flying in every direction as the enormous chunk of oak broke off and dropped fast towards the ground. The old woman felt the vibration as it landed. She was standing only a matter of meters away, the hood of her cloak pulled up over her head. "Now see what you've made me do," she whispered. 40 miles to the north of Alton Towers, the weather was calm, as John Talbot, Charles's elder brother, was riding home from visiting a friend. He was within sight of his house when he suddenly gasped, grabbed his chest, and then fell forward onto the horse's mane. The horse continued to ride until it reached the front yard, whereupon the door to the house flew open and his wife Helen rushed out. "John!" she cried. 2 of the servants ran out to assist in getting him down from the horse. They carried him inside. One of them tried to revive him, with his wife looking on in horror. But there was nothing that could be done for him. He was dead. The following morning, Charles was awoken by a pounding on his chamber door. "Who is that?" he called angrily, annoyed at having been aroused so rudely from his sleep. His manservant, Hedgerson, entered with a message in his hand. He bowed. "My apologies, my lord, but this note has come urgently from your sister-in-law. The messenger told me it must be seen without delay." Charles snatched it from his hand and tore open the little envelope. He read with haste. "Oh God, no. My brother John. He died last night." "I am so sorry, my lord," said his manservant gravely. "How?" "It does not say how. I will arrange for your carriage to be got ready as soon as possible. Will you be requiring breakfast?" Charles didn't seem to hear him. He was standing by the window, staring out into the grounds. Leaves and branches were strewn across the front lawn. "The grounds are a mess," he commented. "Yes, sir. There was a terrible storm last night. I'm surprised it did not wake you." Charles suddenly heard a voice in his head. "For every branch on the old oak tree that falls, a member of your family will die. Get me dressed as quick as you can," he yelled. As soon as his clothes were on, he ran from the house and down the main drive, sprinting as fast as he could towards the old oak. He reached it in no time, and as he saw it, he skidded to a halt, nearly slipping on the wet grass. It felt like someone had reached into his chest and punched his heart. He saw the enormous branch lying on the ground with its charred end. Charles dropped to his knees and screamed. "No!" He started to weep. "My brother! The curse! What have I done?" "My lord!" shouted a voice. Hedgerson had followed his master. "Good God, are you all right?" Charles didn't answer. He was rolling on the ground now, clutching himself in sorrow and wailing like a banshee. Hedgerson ran back to the house for help, and the Earl was taken back to his chamber and laid on his bed. A doctor was called, and he was given laudanum. One of the maids watched over him the rest of the day and throughout the night, monitoring his condition. He broke out in feverish sweats and even talked in his sleep, muttering something about branches and death. Suddenly he sat bolt upright in bed, scaring the life out of the maid, who almost leapt out of her chair. "Master!" she exclaimed. He turned his face to her. "Chain up the old oak tree," he said in a quiet but determined voice. "Chain it up, sir?" she asked, confused. Chain every branch and anchor them to the ground so they cannot fall." His gaze was penetrating. "Tell the groundsman to go to the ironmongers and buy yards of heavy chains. I want that tree secured by tomorrow night." His wish was conveyed to the groundsman first thing, and by 8 o'clock a cart pulled up in front of the enormous tree, creaking under the weight of the thickest links the ironmonger had. Charles was already there, sitting in his carriage. He leapt out when the cart arrived. A dozen men had gathered to help chain up the oak. The Earl gave his commands and oversaw proceedings, shouting up at the men to make sure they got it right, who clambered around like uncertain monkeys. The branch that had broken off still lay on the ground. "I want that taken back to the house. Have it put in the chamber." "Certainly, my lord." With the aid of ropes, the huge branch was dragged behind the cart to the main door. There it was pulled through the halls by 15 men, all grunting and sweating, while Charles simply instructed them where to go. The chamber into which the branch was placed was a large, unfurnished room that had, up to now, not been used, as the Earl realized he did not need it. The enormous branch was placed in the centre, and the men dismissed. Charles stood and stared at it for a long time without moving. It was almost like he had frozen, or been hypnotized by it. "This curse must be lifted at once," he whispered. "For the sake of my family. It is up to me." It so happened that Charles had studied Wiccan at one point when he was a younger man. There could be tools at his disposal. His first idea was to order bundles of sage, which he burned in the chamber, sealing the door closed for 2 days. The burning of sage, he knew, cleansed bad energies. The chaining of the tree should have been enough, but he was a deeply paranoid man, and he wanted to be sure. After the 2-day period, he reopened the room. The aroma of sage filled the air. He then knelt by the branch and said a prayer. Now satisfied that these actions had erased the curse, he breathed deeply. He would pay a visit to his sister-in-law, Helen, and attend the funeral. He sat out in his carriage that afternoon and arrived at his brother's house 2 hours later. He greeted his sister-in-law with open arms. They consoled together. "Are you all right, Helen?" he asked. "Under the circumstances, I am faring okay, thank you." She paused. "I feel numb, if you really want to know. It does not feel real. But I must stay strong for our son." Charles nodded, understanding. "Of course. But I feel the same numbness." He paused awkwardly. "How did it happen?" "He had gone out in the early evening to visit friends. When his horse came into the yard, we found him slumped over. The doctor thinks it was his heart." "His heart? He was a healthy man." "I know. I do not understand it myself. It just makes no sense." She dabbed at her eyes with a hanky. "I suppose God had his reasons for taking him from us." Charles's mouth had gone dry. "Yes, I suppose you are right. We must have faith and trust in his decision." They walked into the living room, where the maid brought them port and biscuits. "When is the funeral?" asked Charles. "On Sunday. God's day." "Amen," said Charles quietly, before taking a sip of port. Later that evening, when Helen and John Jr. had retired to bed, he found he could not sleep. Too many disturbing thoughts in his mind. He descended the stairs and entered the living room once more, with its large arched windows looking out over a pristine lawn. The red curtains were not drawn, and he stood there now, staring out into the shadowy garden. Why? That was indeed the question, and he alone knew the answer. The old hag's curse. It was her disgusting words and actions. Was she a witch? If she could make a curse come true, then surely she was. But why put this kind of curse on him and his family, just because he had refused to give her money? It seemed a little harsh. But then he knew nothing about this woman, about what anger boiled under that ugly visage. Suddenly she was there, staring intently at him from the other side of the glass. Her face was curled into an expression of pure hatred and evil intent. Charles screamed and leapt back from the window. He fell over a chair and banged his head on the floor, after which he saw only blackness and stars. When he awoke, he was lying on the sofa, a glass of brandy at his elbow. Helen was leaning over him, a concerned look on her face. "Charles? Can you hear me?" "I hear you," he replied. "What happened?" "I—" The old woman's face returned to his mind's eye. He sat bolt upright, swivelling himself round to the windows. "Did you see something out there?" asked Helen. Charles paused. "I thought I did." He shook his head. It must have been stress or lack of sleep. "An old woman." "Somebody could be in the grounds," exclaimed Helen. "Samuel," she said, turning to the butler, "tell David and Adam to get their rifles and search the garden for any sign of an intruder." "Yes, ma'am," replied Samuel, and he dashed out of the room. "I do not think it was anything, dear Helen. I am merely scaring myself." "Scaring yourself?" she quizzed. The two men rushed into the garden, their rifles loaded. They searched behind every tree and bush. They did a sweep round the entire house, but they found nothing. The old oak stood tethered to the ground, hung with its haunting decorations. The chains tinkled as a strong breeze blew through the branches, but it was not enough to tear up the stakes that were driven to the ground. And yet one of them, at least, seemed to be moving, twisting itself up out of the earth, as if by a strong, unseen force. The wind, meanwhile, was getting stronger. It blew more furiously through the forest, whipping itself up into another storm. "What are you scared of?" asked Helen. Charles shook his head. "I am not scared of anything other than my warped imagination. The whole situation is so terribly distressing at the moment." Adam and David returned. "There is nobody in the grounds, ma'am," puffed David. "We have checked everywhere." "As I said, it was just—" Helen suddenly swooned and fell. Charles's eyes widened as the two men rushed forward to assist her. "Oh, Christ above, not her too!" muttered Charles. "What is wrong with her?" he cried frantically. "We cannot tell. She will not respond." He placed his fingers on her lips. "She has no breath," he declared. "The curse," thought Charles. "It is not over." At 9 the next morning, a cart pulled away from the house, with a casket on the back. Charles watched it go, his nephew John by his side, his head spinning with grief and panic. How could the curse still be alive? Had the chains not been strong enough? Had there been another storm which dragged them up out of the ground? There was only one way to find out. He called for his coachman and ordered him to drive back to Alton Towers at top speed. All the way there he was brooding, nervously chewing on his fingers like a child. Every so often he had to wipe perspiration from his brow. 3 hours later he stood looking down at the metal stake lying on the grass. A few feet away lay another branch, not as large as the first one. This had been ripped off by a strong wind. "I don't understand how this could happen, my lord," said the head gownsman. "That stake is heavy and was driven deep. It should have held." "Well, it didn't!" roared the Earl with fury. "Get a heavier one next time." Later that evening, Charles went to drown his sorrows in the village tavern. He sat in his usual chair by the fire and spoke to no one. But that didn't mean he was deaf to the conversations around him. At a nearby table, two men were talking. "Shame about old Victor Marshall," said one. "He was a good man, God rest his soul." "Aye, so it was," agreed his companion. "There wasn't a nicer man in the village." "How'd he die again?" "Went mad, apparently. What do they call it? Brain fever." Charles stopped drinking. "I beg your pardon, gentlemen, but I couldn't help overhearing. A man has died of madness, you say?" "That's right, sir. Old Marshall, who lived in Epping Croft. Did you know him?" "The name certainly rings a bell. I believe I knew him many years ago. He taught me." The man frowned as they looked at each other. "Man wasn't a teacher, sir. What I mean is he was a follower of Wiccan. He taught me the ways. But as I said, that was a long time ago, and I have since abandoned those." "Did you know his wife, too?" "It seems she up and left. Nobody can find her." "No doubt she was very upset," said his friend. "They were as close as any couple could be." He raised his tankard. "To both of them," he said. The two men drank a toast. Charles left the tavern. He spoke to his coachman. "Wait here, Mayfield. I'm going for a walk. I shan't be long." He walked briskly along the main street. Died of madness. The old hag had said her husband had recently died the same way. Could this be her husband? He reached Epping Croft 5 minutes later. He hammered at the door. After getting no response, he cautiously tried the latch. The door was not locked, and he stepped inside. He stopped abruptly, the door latch still in his hand. Charles gazed about him in astonishment. The walls were covered in animal skulls. Half-burned candles were dotted around. 2 chairs and a desk, cluttered with papers, along with a small fireplace, completed this living space. He had forgotten how it looked. The last time he had been here was when he was a boy of 18. There were not as many skulls then. He closed the door behind him and stepped forward. He wasn't quite sure what he was doing here. According to the men in the bar, the wife was missing. He barely remembered her, but he was sure now this was the woman who had cursed him. Just then, above the desk, he noticed a small oil painting of a lady. He moved closer to study it. It was a recent portrait of his wife, and the image sent a chill down his spine. It was her. He recognized the fearsome face immediately. He grabbed the painting off the wall and left the house. Nobody knew where she was, but he would do his damnedest to find her. As the carriage raced back to Alton Towers, Charles gripped the frame tight in his hand. He would find her, and he would force her to remove the curse. By however means necessary, he muttered savagely. The next morning, he gathered every man that worked for him and showed them the portrait. "We are going to search high and low for this witch," he cried. "Every barn, every wood, every outhouse. She must be found. When she is, I want her alive. Bring her back here. I will give a reward to the ones who find her first." He set them out on their challenge. For 2 days they searched without success, until on the 3rd day a report came back to the Earl that the body of an old woman, matching the description of the portrait, had been found hanging from a beam in a disused barn. The body had obviously been hanging there for a while, for it had begun to decompose. The Earl rode out to see it. They had cut her down and covered her with a rug. When they drew it back for Charles to see, he clapped a handkerchief to his nose. "It's her," he said, nodding. "Well done, gentlemen. You will get your reward for this." So she was dead. This surely meant that the curse would now be lifted. He rode back to his mansion with a lighter heart. He dined with gusto that evening, and as he sat, stuffing his face with a beautifully roasted capon, he decided that another grand party was in order. Over the following few days he had invitations sent out to his usual guest list. The party would take place in 2 weeks, and RSVPs were required. Among his guests were his mother, Mary, his younger brother, Archibald, and his 2 uncles on his father's side, Edwin and James. Those 2 weeks passed peacefully. The tree remained fully intact, the weather was beautiful, and Charles spent a lot of his time walking in his grounds and reading in his great library. On the night of the party he was in his best mood. All of his invites had been accepted, and as the carriages rolled up and the creme de la creme of society strolled into his house, his chest swelled with pride. He was indeed an important person, with important friends. There was to be dinner and a ball. The dinner was a huge success. The wine flowed as smoothly as the conversation, and the food was of the best quality. When it was finished, the guests all promenaded into the grand ballroom with its 4 massive crystal chandeliers. "I cannot join in the dancing, Charles," said his mother. "I will sit and watch." Charles escorted her to a chair near this side of the room. "You are right beneath one of the chandeliers, mother. The light shines down on you like an angel." She patted his arm. "Thank you for inviting me, my darling. I do hope your old mother is not an embarrassment in front of your friends. Not at all. Do not speak so." "John would have loved this," she said. "I pray he is at peace." Charles merely kissed her forehead and walked away. He danced for an hour before leaving for the privy. He left the ballroom and walked along the corridor, with its Gothic arched ceiling bending over his head like a tunnel of trees. As he rounded a corner, he stopped dead. The old woman stood in front of him. In her wrinkled hand, she held a brown sack. "No!" gasped Charles. "You cannot be real. We found your body. You are dead." The old hag began to laugh, and as she did so, she tipped the bag upside down, and out fell 4 pieces of wood. They looked like mere kindling, but their significance was far more terrible. The old woman's laugh became louder. Charles turned and fled back to the ballroom. The laugh followed him through the echoing halls as he ran, his heart pounding with fear. And then another sound came harshly to his ears, the sound of screaming, followed by an almighty smash. He reached the ballroom in time to see the immediate aftermath. Absolute chaos. One of the chandeliers had fallen. It lay on the floor in glittering pieces. From beneath it, a steady stream of blood was trickling. In an instant, Charles realized whose blood it was. "Mother!" he screamed. The crowd was standing well back from the horror. Women were fainting. Some were running out of the ballroom. Charles sprinted forward. It was only then did he see part of his mother's dress protruding from under the wreckage. And something else. Archibald lay there too, his head shattered, his dead eyes seeming to stare into his own blood pool. Charles clasped his head in his hands and let out the most curdling, agonized wail. Both Edwin and James rushed to his side. The old woman shuffled slowly along the hallway. She was smiling, a contented, gleeful smile. As she walked, she reached casually into the bag and drew out one more stick, which she dropped on the flagstone floor. She never stopped, just carried on walking until she faded out of sight. "The old woman," shouted Charles suddenly. "It is her doing. Find her! She is here in this very building. I saw her. What are you talking about? Have you gone mad?" And then, in an instant flash of memory, like an explosion in his mind, he remembered. They were in the little cottage. It was night, and all the candles were lit. Marshall was reading from a book that lay on the table in front of them, while his wife Elspeth sat knitting by the fire. Charles was tired. He had been riding that morning. He tried to listen to what Marshall was saying about the pagan beliefs and about earth energies, but he found he was quickly losing interest. He couldn't care less. It had ceased to have any meaning to his life. It also sounded ludicrous. Suddenly, in a temper, Charles spat out his feelings to Marshall in a torrent of frustration and boredom. "Oh, just stop with your pagan nonsense," he cried. "Listen to yourself. Do you know how you sound? Mad. Mad is how you sound, and mad is what you are. And you will die mad." He rose so violently from his chair that it tipped backwards onto the floor with a clatter. "I will not be coming back here." And with that, he left Epping Croft for the last time, slamming the door behind him. "You will die mad." "I beg your pardon?" said Edwin. "That's what I said to him, to Victor Marshall. And he did. I cursed him, but I didn't mean to. I was just ranting." "You're ranting now, man. You need to come away from here. James, help me with him." Together they lifted Charles to his feet and removed him from the ballroom and the scene of the carnage. They took him outside for some fresh air. Some of the guests were leaving in their carriages, and rain had begun to fall heavily, dropping in a vertical sheet. The 3 men sheltered under the canopy over the door. "Archibald," wailed Charles, his eyes closed, his face that of a tortured soul. "Mother." Lightning flashed in the sky, illuminating that face in a flickering white moment. And in that same moment, one of the horses, spooked by the lightning, broke loose from her carriage and cantered off down the drive and across the front lawn. Edwin immediately darted after it. He was used to handling horses. He ran flat out towards it. Just as he reached the beast, he slipped on the wet grass and fell flat on his back. The horse, still frightened as it was, reared up, kicking its front hooves wildly in the air. As it came down again, the thrashing hooves landed on Edward's head, killing him outright. "Edwin!" roared James. He too ran out into the rain towards his brother. Charles collapsed and blacked out on the front step. Now the mayhem and horror had followed the party guests outside. They jumped into their available carriages and left Alton Towers as fast as they could. James dropped to his knees by his brother's side. The horse had disappeared into the storm-battered night. James took Edwin in his arms and wept over him. And then, in a moment of utter despair, he took the dagger that Edwin always kept in his boot and plunged it into his heart. It was 2 weeks later. The head butler was taking the doctor upstairs to see his patient when they heard a crazed scream coming from above them. The doctor froze mid-step. Good God. He has been like this since that terrible night, Doctor. The laudanum you prescribed has done nothing to help. He is now raving mad. They continued up to the Earl's chamber. I have locked him in for his own safety, and that of the servants. The head butler now fitted a key into the door and opened it. The doctor hesitated before going in. He saw the Earl immediately. He was on the floor by the window, curled into himself, his legs tucked up into his chest. He was making funny, intermittent noises and shuddering. His eyes were closed. The doctor stared at him in horror. He needs to be sectioned at once. Charles suddenly let out another scream and leapt to his feet. He ran at the two men, who parted instantly out of self-preservation. Charles bolted through the open door and down the stairs before they could even think to stop him. He ran to the dining room and grabbed an old battle-axe from one wall, then sprinted back through the corridor, heading for the chamber where the hunk of oak lay. He entered and locked the door behind him. Then he flew at the massive branch, raising the axe high in the air. He began hacking into it with loud grunts and screams. Again and again he swung until the branch lay in pieces on the floor. He dropped the axe and fell against the wall out of sheer exhaustion, sweat pouring down his face. And then he heard her. The voice echoed around the chamber. "Now you know how it feels," hissed the voice. "Loss and madness. You put a curse on my husband. I gave you a chance to redeem yourself, but you chose not to take it. So I put a curse on you, one that I knew would tear your mind into pieces." Charles could not answer. "There was one last stick in my bag, Charles Talbot, a stick that will bring the curse to an end." With a sudden flare, flames began to inexplicably appear out of the center of the woodpile. They licked hungrily at the dry bark, which crackled and spat, and before long the chamber was filled with heat and smoke. The Earl began to cough, and as he lay choking on the fumes that billowed down his throat, his dying eyes fell upon a vague form, standing before him in the center of the fire. And to this day, it is said that if you visit the Towers late at night, on the anniversary of Charles Talbot's death, you can sometimes hear a woman's voice. She is laughing with maniacal pleasure, a sound that floats through the trees, as if like wind.